He dropped to her knees before he could say a word. That was the thing that stopped Damien Calloway cold. Not the shattered crystal, not the sound of it exploding across the marble floor like a gunshot, but the way Elena Ashford went down, fast, practiced, the way someone drops when they already know what comes next. Her hands moved through the broken glass without hesitation, fingers bleeding almost immediately, and she didn't make a sound. Not a whimper. Not an apology. Just silence and submission and the quiet, mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing 100 times before. Damien had broken men twice her size. He'd sat across tables from federal prosecutors and smiled. He'd buried people who thought they could threaten him and slept fine afterward. But watching this woman collect glass shards with her bare, bleeding hands, like punishment was not just expected but already accepted, was the first thing in years that made him feel something close to sick. He crouched down, got level with her. She flinched back like he'd raised a fist. He hadn't moved his hands at all. That was the moment. That flinch, that involuntary full-body recoil from a man who was simply looking at her, told him everything he needed to know about the life Elena Ashford had lived before she walked through his front door. If you've ever watched someone disappear while standing right in front of you, drop a like and leave your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because this is only the beginning of something that will shake you to the core. Well, Elena had been with the Calloway household for 11 days. She'd arrived through an agency, or what appeared to be one. A woman named Ms. Pryor had driven her to the estate in a gray sedan, handed her a laminated card with a list of duties, and told her not to speak unless spoken to, not to enter the East Wing without permission, and not to make eye contact with Mr. Calloway unless he addressed her directly. The instructions were delivered the way someone recites a safety briefing on an airplane, flat, practiced, and clearly designed for someone who had already heard worse. Elena had already heard worse. She was 26. She looked younger in the face and older everywhere else. There were things about her body that didn't match. The way she moved through rooms without making sound. The way she checked exits before she checked anything else. The way her shoulders never fully came down from her ears, no matter how quiet the house got. She had light brown hair she kept pulled back so tight it looked deliberate, and green eyes that processed a room the way a security camera does, steady, sweeping, missing nothing. The mansion sat on 40 acres of coastal Maine, gated and guarded, and Elena had spent 11 days learning its rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of a place you're not sure is safe. She knew which floorboards creaked and which didn't. She knew what time the night guard switched rotations. She knew that Damien Calloway took his coffee black and bitter and alone, that he worked until 2 a.m. most nights, and that he never once raised his voice at the staff, which she had not expected and did not entirely trust. The crystal glass had belonged to a set of 12. She'd been carrying it from the dining room to the kitchen when her sleeve caught the edge of the door frame. A door frame she had cleared every day for 11 days without incident. The glass slipped. She had maybe half a second to decide what to do about it, and spent that half second doing exactly nothing, which was its own kind of decision. One made not in her brain but somewhere lower and older, a place in her that had learned a long time ago that reacting fast only made things worse. The sound of it hitting the marble was enormous in the quiet house. And then she was on her knees, and her hands were moving through the glass, and the blood came almost immediately. A thin line across 3 fingers of her right hand, then the palm, and she registered the sensation the way she registered most pain now, which was distantly. The way you register weather you're already standing inside of. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of a chair scraping back in the study. Footsteps. Measured, unhurried. She kept her eyes down and her hands moving. He stopped in the doorway. She could see his shoes. Dark leather. Clean. He didn't move. She was bleeding onto the marble and she didn't say anything, and he still didn't move, and the silence between them stretched out long enough that her hands started to shake, just slightly, from the effort of holding herself absolutely still inside it. Stop. His voice was low, not angry. That was the first thing she noticed about it. No edge in it, no heat, just a flat command the way you'd say it to a dog that was chewing something it shouldn't. She stopped. Stand up. She didn't, immediately. Her body ran a quick internal calculation, the kind that happens below language, below conscious thought, and apparently decided that standing up was slightly more dangerous than staying where she was, because she hesitated for just a beat too long before her legs pushed her upright. When she finally looked at him, she did it the way Miss Pryor had instructed. Brief, peripheral. Not quite meeting his eyes. Damien Calloway was 41 years old and built like someone who had spent his 20s doing hard physical labor and his 30s learning how to make other people do it instead. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that wasn't handsome exactly, but was arresting. The kind of face that holds a room because the person wearing it has never once walked into a situation without believing they were the most dangerous thing in it. He was looking at her hands. She became aware of them at the same time he did. Her right hand was bleeding freely now, blood working into the lines of her palm, and the left wasn't much better. She'd caught the base of her thumb on a larger piece. She'd been so focused on collecting the shards that she hadn't registered how bad it was. She moved to cover her hands behind her back. "Don't," he said. Same flat tone. She stopped. He crossed the space between them and took her right hand in both of his, and the contact made every muscle in her body go rigid at once. His grip was firm but careful, the way you hold something you don't want to break further, and he turned her palm up toward the light from the hallway. He looked at it for a long time, not at the fresh cuts from the glass, at what was already there. Her hands were a history. 3 fingers of her left hand had healed crooked after breaking. The bones never set properly, the joints swollen and stiff in the cold. There were burn scars across the back of her right hand, old and silvered, the kind left by something narrow and hot, a cigarette maybe, or the edge of an iron. The inside of her left wrist carried a long, thin scar that was clearly not from glass, too straight, too deliberate, old enough to be white. And underneath all of it, the texture of her skin in places was wrong, layered, the way skin gets when it's been damaged and healed and damaged again in roughly the same location. Damien did not say anything. He held her hand in the light and looked at it, and his face did something complicated. She caught it in her peripheral vision, even though she wasn't looking directly at him. Something moved through it that wasn't pity exactly, because pity has a kind of softness to it, a distance. What moved through his face was harder than that, more like recognition, more like rage that didn't have anywhere to go yet and knew it. "Who did this?" he said. Not a question. She noticed that. Not even inflected like one. "It was the glass," she said. "I'm sorry about the glass. I'll replace it out of my—" "Not tonight." He said it quietly, just cutting under her words. The rest of it. She looked at the wall past his left ear. "I fall," she said. "I'm clumsy." The silence that followed was long enough that she could hear her own heartbeat. "All right," he said. He didn't believe her. He wasn't pretending to. He released her hand and straightened up and looked at her face for the first time. Really looked. The kind of direct, sustained attention she had trained herself to deflect. And she let him, because looking away felt suddenly like the more dangerous option. "Come with me," he said. The kitchen was at the back of the house, large and bright and aggressively clean, the kind of kitchen that gets cleaned the same way whether anyone cooks in it or not. He knew where the first aid kit was kept, which surprised her. Not because she thought powerful men were helpless, but because in her experience, powerful men were helpless in specific, practiced ways, one of which was not knowing where the bandages were. He set the kit on the island and opened it without asking her to sit down, so she sat down without being told, because the instructions seemed implied, and she'd learned a long time ago to move ahead of instructions rather than wait for them. He cleaned her hands himself. She watched his face while he did it and tried to read it and mostly couldn't. He was careful. More careful than the task required, working the glass splinters out with tweezers he found in the kit without rushing, without squeezing the wounds to make the bleeding stop faster, the way people sometimes do when they don't quite register that the thing bleeding is connected to a person. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know. You can sit still," he said, and there was something almost dry in it, something that wasn't quite humor, but was adjacent to it, and she didn't know what to do with that, so she sat still. He wrapped her right hand, then her left. Clean bandages, white, covering the fresh cuts and nothing else, because the old damage wasn't something tape could address. "You've been here 11 days, he said. "Yes. You haven't asked for anything." "I don't need anything. Everyone needs something." He set down the last of the tape and looked at her. "You don't sleep. I hear you at 4 in the morning sometimes, moving around downstairs." She hadn't known he could hear that. The realization moved through her cold and fast, and she filed it without showing it. "I have insomnia," she said. "Sometimes you're in the kitchen, sometimes you're at the back door." She said nothing. "Are you thinking about running?" he asked. Just like that. Not accusatory, not threatening, just a man asking a direct question and deciding to wait for a real answer. She looked at him. Actually looked, eyes meeting his for a full second, which was longer than she normally allowed. He had dark eyes, near black, and they were on her with a steadiness that was different from the way men usually looked at her. No agenda in it that she could read, no anticipation of what she was going to say next, just attention, pure, exhausting, complete attention. "I don't know where I'd go," she said. It wasn't the same as no. He seemed to understand that. "All right," he said again. He closed the first aid kit and pushed it to the side of the island. "The glass doesn't matter. Go to sleep." She stood up from the stool. Her hands throbbed. She was almost at the kitchen door when he spoke again. "Elena?" She stopped. "The agency that placed you." He was still standing at the island, not looking at her. "What was the woman's name? The one who brought you here?" Her heart did something that had no clean name. "Ms. Pryor," she said. He nodded slowly, like he'd known the answer before he asked, like the question was about something else entirely. "Good night," he said. She went upstairs. She did not sleep. In the morning, Damien called a man named Marcus, who was nominally his head of security, and actually something more layered than that. A former investigator who had spent 20 years learning where the bodies were in various criminal and governmental organizations, before deciding that working for one specific criminal organization was cleaner and more honest than the alternatives. "I need a background on someone," Damien said. "Her name is Elena Ashford. She's currently working here as household staff." "Current employee check?" "No, full history. Everything you can find on her from birth. And I need you to look at an agency called Check the Records. They sent her here. Something connected to a woman named Pryor. First name unknown." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "This about something you think she did, or something you think was done to her?" Damien looked at the window. The Maine coast, gray and cold and flat. "Second one," he said. "That's going to take a few days." "Start now." He hung up and sat for a moment with his coffee going cold on the desk. He was not a sentimental man. He had not built what he'd built by letting sentiment make decisions. The organization he ran moved money and people and influence across the eastern seaboard in ways that were profitable and illegal and occasionally involved a degree of violence that he thought about in purely operational terms, the way a contractor thinks about materials. But he kept seeing her hands. Not the fresh cuts, like those were superficial, nothing, but the old damage. The cigarette burns, the crooked fingers, the scar that was too straight and too deliberate to be anything but what it was. He'd seen a lot of violence in his life, and he'd caused a share of it, and he knew what violence looked like when it was done over time, systematically, to someone who'd stopped expecting it to end. He had people. He had resources. He had the ability to find out things that other people couldn't find out, and to do things about those findings that operated outside the usual channels. Whatever had happened to Elena Ashford, he was going to find out what it was. He didn't examine why. Not closely. He'd learned a long time ago that some decisions weren't helped by being examined too closely, and this felt like one of them. Elena spent the morning the way she spent most mornings, working through the house in precise, efficient silence, cleaning things that were already clean, straightening things that were already straight, giving herself the structure of tasks because structure was the only thing that had ever made her feel like she was occupying time rather than just surviving it. She was 26 years old. She had been in 17 different placements since she was 8. Most of them had not been bad in ways that would have been legible to a social worker running a scheduled home check. No obvious deprivation, no visible bruises in the wrong places, adequate food, clean clothes. The Mercer family, who had taken her at 12 and kept her through 18, had been respected members of their community. Gerald and Patricia Mercer. They ran the Mercer Family Foundation, which gave grants to literacy programs and community health clinics, and was profiled twice in regional magazines as a model of philanthropic engagement. When she thought about the Mercers, and she tried not to, but sometimes it happened anyway, she thought about them in images. Not narratives, not scenes, just images. Patricia Mercer's face when she was angry, which was different from Patricia Mercer's face when she was in public. So different, it was like two separate women sharing a skull. Gerald Mercer's hands, the basement room where she'd slept her first winter with them, before she learned what she needed to learn to earn a bedroom upstairs. She thought about the other girls who'd been through that house. Some she'd known by name, most she hadn't. Some had disappeared, and the Mercers had described it to social services as running away. Maybe some of them had. Mostly she thought they hadn't. She'd left at 18. She'd told herself for years that leaving was the same as escaping. It had taken her a long time to understand the difference. She was in the east hallway, rehanging a painting that had been sitting 3 degrees off for days and that no one else seemed to notice or care about, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Damien. He was in a suit jacket and no tie, phone in one hand, and he stopped when he saw her and looked at the painting and then at her. "That's been bothering you," he said. "It was crooked." "I know. I noticed when they hung it 4 years ago." He paused. "I kept meaning to fix it." She looked at him. "Then why didn't you?" He considered this for a moment with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. "I kept expecting it to resolve itself," he said, and something in his face suggested he was talking about more than the painting. He kept walking. She watched him go and then turned back to the painting and made the last small adjustment and stepped back to check it. Straight. Finally, straight. She stood there for longer than the task required, both bandaged hands at her sides, the hallway empty and quiet around her, and for the first time in days she did not check the exits. She did not calculate distances. She just stood there and looked at the straight painting and felt something she couldn't name immediately. It took her a moment to identify it because she'd gone so long without it. The feeling was fine. She felt fine. Right now, in this moment, she was fine. It lasted about 15 seconds before her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. She knew before she answered it that it would be a voice she recognized. "Eleanor," said Patricia Mercer. She was the only person who still used that name. "We need you to come home." Elena's hand tightened around the phone. Her eyes went to the window at the end of the hallway. Outside, gray sky, bare trees, the long gravel drive leading to the front gate. "I'm working," she said. "We know where you're working." A pause. Measured, deliberate. The pause of someone who uses silence the way other people use exclamation points. "We've given you quite a bit of time, Eleanor. We've been patient. But this has gone on long enough. And there are people who need answers that only you can give. I don't have anything to tell anyone. That's not what we're concerned about." Another pause. "Come home. We'll sort everything out together as a family." The word family, in Patricia Mercer's mouth, had always been a threat dressed up as comfort. Elena had spent years learning to hear the threat without reacting to the comfort. "I have to go," Elena said. "Eleanor." She ended the call, stood very still. Her heart was hitting her ribs hard enough that she could feel it in her bandaged hands. They knew where she was. She should leave. That was the calculation her body ran immediately and automatically. She should leave tonight, pack the 3 things she actually owned, and be gone before morning. She'd done it before. She was good at it. She knew how to disappear. But she thought about what Damien had said the night before. "Are you thinking about running?" She thought about her answer. "I don't know where I'd go." She thought about standing at this exact window every morning for 11 days, watching the gate, telling herself she was assessing the situation, telling herself she was waiting for the right moment, knowing, somewhere underneath all of that, that she was waiting for something she couldn't name. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. Her hands were shaking very slightly inside the bandages, and she pressed them flat against her thighs as she walked, and by the time she reached the kitchen, she had them under control. She had learned a long time ago that control was the thing That if you could control the surface, the inside could do whatever it needed to do. That if you looked calm enough for long enough, eventually the people watching you stopped watching. She just needed to stay calm, just a little longer, until she figured out what came next. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that Marcus had already been working for 6 hours, and that what he was beginning to find in the records of the Mercer Family Foundation was not a history of philanthropy. It was something else entirely, something that had been hidden in plain sight for over 20 years, behind press releases and grant announcements and the kind of social respectability that functions like a force field against scrutiny. And it had Elena Ashford's name in it, in ways she'd never been told about, in ways that had been decided for her long before she was old enough to understand what was being decided. Down the hall in his study, Damian Calloway sat with his second coffee and waited for Marcus to call back. And the longer he waited, the more certain he became that whatever he was about to learn was going to make the next phase of his life considerably more complicated than the last. He was not wrong. Marcus called back at 7:13 in the morning. Damian had been awake for 2 hours already, which was normal. He slept badly and had for years, and had long since made peace with the fact that the hours between 4 and 6 belonged to whatever part of his brain refused to shut down, so he used them. He was at his desk with the third coffee of the morning when his phone buzzed, and he picked it up before the second ring. "Talk to me," he said. Marcus's voice on the other end had a quality Damian had learned to read over 15 years, a particular flatness that arrived when Marcus had found something bad enough that he was choosing his words carefully before he said them. "The Mercer Family Foundation," Marcus said. "How much do you want first?" "All of it." A pause. "The foundation's been operating for 23 years, publicly funded, legitimate grant recipients on record, 2 magazine profiles, 1 regional business ethics award. Gerald Mercer sits on the advisory board of 3 hospital systems and a university endowment. Patricia Mercer runs the foundation day to day. She's photographed at charity dinners twice a month." "And underneath that," Marcus said, "the foundation's been moving money. Not through normal channels, through a series of subsidiary nonprofits, each one layered inside the next, each one just clean enough on paper to pass a surface audit. The money comes in from private donors, very large, very private donors, and it goes out through grant disbursements that don't match any legitimate recipient I can verify. The amounts are substantial. We're talking 12, 15 million a year minimum, and that's conservative based on what I can trace. The real number is probably double." Damian was quiet for a moment. "Trafficking?" "The infrastructure matches. Shell organizations in 4 states. Transfer patterns consistent with moving people. Not goods. People. And there's something else." Another pause, longer. "Elena Ashford doesn't exist before she's 8 years old. Her records start with a placement in a group home in Western Massachusetts in 2006. No birth certificate that I can verify as original. No biological family documented. The name itself..." Marcus stopped. "It's possible the name was assigned, not chosen." Damian set his coffee down. "The Mercers placed her. The foundation coordinated the placement through a subsidiary organization that no longer exists on paper. The subsidiary dissolved in 2009, but its activity records overlap with the Mercer Foundation's financial records by about 70%. A beat. "She was with them from 12 to 18. She left, and for about 6 months she moved around, shelters, short-term jobs, and then she dropped out of traceable systems almost entirely for 2 years. When she surfaces again, she's in a different state, different city, different set of documents that are real but thin. Social security number that checks out but only barely. Someone helped her build those documents." "Someone helped her," Marcus agreed. "I don't know who yet. She's been moving every few months since then, working through placement agencies. The agency that sent her to you, Prior Associates. I'm still running that down, but the woman, this Prior, she's a name that shows up in 2 other placement chains I've connected to foundation-adjacent organizations. She might be helping Elena stay hidden, or she might be how the Mercers track her." The silence in the study was complete. Damian could hear the wind off the coast pressing against the window glass. "They're looking for her," he said. It wasn't a question. "They've been looking for her for 4 years. Marcus's voice was still flat, but there was something underneath it now. Something careful and controlled, the way a man sounds when what he's found has bothered him personally. Whatever she knows, or whatever they think she knows, they want her back badly enough to keep a search active for 4 years. That's not standard protocol for someone who left a placement. That's something else. Damien stood up from the desk and walked to the window. The drive was empty. The gate was closed. The trees along the property line stood bare and still in the early light. Pull everything you can on the subsidiary organizations, he said. Financial records, incorporation documents, any personnel overlap with the foundation. I want names, real names, not the ones on the letterhead. That's going to require going into some places I don't usually go, Marcus said. I know, go there. He hung up and stood at the window for a moment. Then he turned and went upstairs. Elena's room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of the staff hallway. He knocked twice. There was a long pause before the door opened, long enough that he knew she'd been awake and standing on the other side of it, deciding whether to answer. She was dressed already, hair pulled back, the bandages on her hands fresh. She'd changed them herself sometime in the night. She looked at him with the steady, measuring look he was beginning to recognize, the one that processed everything and gave back nothing. You got a phone call last night, he said. Her face didn't change. I get phone calls. Who was it? She looked past his left shoulder for a moment, the way she did when she was deciding how much to give. Someone I used to know, she said. Patricia Mercer. The name hit her visibly. A small contraction around her eyes, a tightening at the corners of her mouth, there and gone in under a second. But he'd been watching for it, and he caught it. Come downstairs, he said. We need to talk. She followed him to the kitchen because that seemed to be where they ended up. The kitchen with its hard light and clean surfaces, the most honest room in the house. He poured coffee without asking if she wanted it and set it in front of her and sat across the island and put both hands flat on the counter. I know about the foundation, he said. The silence that followed was of a specific quality. Not shocked, not defensive, but the silence of someone who had been braced for this moment for a long time and was now deciding what to do with the arrival of it. What do you think you know, she said, enough to understand why they've been looking for you for 4 years? He held her eyes. I'm not asking you to tell me everything, but I need you to tell me one thing right now. Are you safe here, or are you going to run the moment you think I'm asleep? She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, the bandaged fingers, the crooked knuckles. If I ran, she said carefully, where would that leave you? That's not an answer. It's the honest part of the answer. She looked down at the mug. If they find me here, they won't just come for me. They'll come for everyone who's associated with me. That's how they operate. They don't threaten people directly. They build a story around them. They'll say you kidnapped me. They'll say you're holding me here against my will. They'll find people to corroborate it. She paused. They've done it before. To other people who tried to help me. Damien processed this without showing what he thought of it. Who else tried to help you? She shook her head. Not unwilling, exactly. More like the memory was something she couldn't pick up without it cutting her. A woman at a shelter. About 3 years ago. She started asking questions. The right questions, the kind that would have led somewhere. And within 2 weeks she'd been reported to her employer for financial misconduct that she didn't commit, and her professional license was under review, and she called me and told me to stop contacting her and sounded like she was reading from a script. Elena's voice stayed level through all of it, which was its own kind of damage report. She was trying to help me. She lost her job anyway. And the person who built your new documents, Damien said, 4 years ago. Her eyes came up sharply, fast. You found that. I found the edges of it. I don't have a name. She studied him. He let her. He'd found a long time ago that the most useful thing you could do in a room where someone was deciding whether to trust you was to hold still and not perform trustworthiness, because performing it was exactly what the wrong kind of person did. Her name is Judith, Elena said finally. She worked for the foundation for 11 years before she figured out what she was working for. When she figured it out, she took what she could carry and she ran. A pause. She helped me because she felt responsible. She'd processed my intake paperwork when I was 12. She hadn't known what it meant at the time. Another pause. I don't know where Judith is now. I hope she's somewhere they haven't found. Damien looked at her. What do you know, specifically, that they're afraid of? She was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a bird hit the window. A brief percussion, and both of them registered it, and neither flinched. There's a name, she said. One name I've been protecting for 4 years. A person. Not the Mercers. Above the Mercers, who controls the financial architecture of the whole operation. The foundation is a piece of it. There are other pieces in other states, other countries. The Mercers move people. This person moves the money that makes it possible, and the money is what connects everything. And if you have the name and you know where to look, you can trace it all the way to the top. She stopped. I have never said this name to anyone, not out loud. Why? Because anyone I say it to becomes a target. She met his eyes. Including you. Damien held her gaze. Say it anyway. She opened her mouth, and that was the moment his phone rang. He would think about that later. The fraction of a second between her breath in and the sound of the phone, and what it cost her to close her mouth again and look away. He answered. It was Marcus, and the flatness in his voice had become something else entirely. We have a problem, Marcus said. There are 2 vehicles outside your front gate. They've been there for 20 minutes. No plates I can read from the camera angle. They're positioned to avoid it. 4 men visible, possibly more in the second vehicle. Damien was on his feet before Marcus finished the sentence. How'd they get past the perimeter alerts? They're not past them. They're at the gate, not through it. But the positioning, these are people who know how to watch a property without technically trespassing. They're waiting for something. Damien looked at Elena. She was watching him with her steady camera surveillance eyes, and she had already understood from his posture what was happening before he said a word. Lock down the east wing, he said to Marcus. Get Carter and Reeves to the main floor. Tell them minimal presence. I don't want anyone outside yet. He ended the call. Elena stood up from the stool. How long have they been outside, she said. 20 minutes that we know of. He was already moving toward the hallway. They tracked you here faster than I expected. They tracked me here the moment Patricia called. Her voice had gone very flat. Not afraid, or not only afraid, something colder than fear. She wasn't calling to ask me to come home. She was calling to confirm I was still here, so they knew exactly where to send people. Damien stopped walking, turned. You knew that when she called. I suspected it. A beat. I should have told you. Yes, he said. You should have. Not angry. There wasn't time for anger. From now on, everything you know is information I need. Understood? She nodded once, tight, controlled. The nod of someone who had operated alone for 4 years and was recalibrating to a different mode of survival, which was not a fast recalibration, and she was making it in real time. There are things I haven't told you, she said. I know. Some of them are things that make this worse. I assume that too. He held the hallway watching her. Are you going to tell me now? They're already outside, she said. Then yes, now. They went to his study. The house had changed, subtle, but she felt it. The particular quality of a space that has gone on to alert. Footsteps on the floor above. A door closing with deliberate quiet on the east wing. The guards were moving without being visible, which meant they were professionals, which was the first thing in this sequence that felt like it was working in her direction. Marcus was in the study when they arrived, standing over a laptop with live feeds from the property cameras. The 2 vehicles were exactly where he'd described, positioned just outside the gate, angled to limit their visibility to the cameras. She looked at the screen for a moment and then looked away. Tell me about the financier, Damien said. His name is... She stopped. Started again. Before I say it, you need to understand something. The reason I've been protecting this name isn't just that saying it makes you a target. It's also that saying it to the wrong person ends any chance of using it. If it gets back to him that someone has his name attached to the foundation's financial structure, every piece of evidence I can point to disappears inside 24 hours. He has the resources to make things disappear. He's done it before. I'm not the wrong person, Damien said. I know that, she said. I think I know that. 4 years of moving around and not trusting anyone. That's not a habit you break in 11 days. Marcus looked up from the laptop, from the Kia. Something passed between the two men, the shorthand of long association. And Marcus moved to the far end of the room and put his back to them, pretending to study the camera feeds. Elena looked at Damien. He held her gaze and did not perform trustworthiness, and did not rush her, and just waited. His name is Victor Crane, she said. He runs a private equity firm called Crane Capital Group out of Boston. Legitimate operation on the surface, real investments, real portfolio companies. He's been a donor to the Mercer Foundation for 18 years. What most people don't know is that he's also structured the financial accounts of every shell nonprofit in the Foundation's network. He's the one who designed the money flow. The reason the Foundation's finances pass surface audits is because Victor Crane is very good at making things look clean that aren't. She watched Damien's face. Watched something move through it that she couldn't read completely. Recognition, she thought. The particular kind of recognition that precedes a problem. You know him, she said. Damien was quiet for a moment. Crane Capital Group. Another moment. I've conducted 2 transactions through a subsidiary of theirs. 3 years ago, real estate. Nothing connected to anything you've described. It was a straight commercial deal. She felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. That means he has your name. He has my company's name. There's a layer between us. But even as he said it, his voice carried the weight of someone doing rapid damage assessment. It's enough of a layer that it wouldn't connect directly, but if someone wanted to build a story, they already are. She was on her feet without realizing she'd stood up. That's why they sent people here. Not just to take me back, to photograph me leaving with you, to document that I've been here. They're building the kidnapping narrative right now, out there in those 2 vehicles. Men with cameras, with records, with whatever they've been told to observe and document. She pressed her bandaged hands flat against her thighs. The story they're going to tell is that you and Victor Crane are connected, that you've been holding me here at his direction, that whatever I know, you were keeping me from saying it. The room was very quiet. Marcus turned around from the camera feeds. His face had the expression of someone who has just watched a chessboard rearrange itself into a configuration that changes everything about the game. That's elegant, Marcus said. It was not a compliment. They've had 4 years to think about it, Elena said. Damien looked at the camera feeds. The 2 vehicles still and patient outside the gate. Men who were being paid to sit and wait and document. Men who would report back to someone who would make those documents into a story, and the story would go to people with the authority to act on it. And by the time anyone sorted out the truth from the architecture of the lie, the original evidence would be gone, and she would be back in a room she didn't choose in a house she couldn't leave, and Victor Crane would have protected himself so thoroughly that no one would ever be able to reconstruct what she'd seen. She had known this was coming. She had not known it would come this fast. I need to make a decision, she said. What decision? Damien said. Whether to run. She said it quietly, precisely. Right now, tonight, before those people outside have what they need. If I'm not here, there's no story. There's no kidnapping. You're clean. Crane has no leverage over you, and whatever happens to me is... No, Damien said. Just that. One word. Flat and immediate, the way he'd said stop in the hallway the night before. She stopped. That's not a decision you're making, he said. It's my life. And you've been making that decision alone for 4 years, and you're standing in my house bleeding through bandages. He held her eyes. Running isn't working. You know it isn't working. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her jaw was tight. What would actually work, he said, is using what you have. The name, the financial structure, any documentation you can reconstruct. We take it to someone who can act on it before Crane has time to clean house. He looked at Marcus. Who do we have on the federal side that's actually clean? Marcus tilted his head. Define clean. Not connected to Crane, not connected to anything the Foundation touches. That's a narrower list than you'd like. Marcus thought for a moment. There's an investigator out of the Boston field office, woman named Hargrove. She's been running a financial crimes task force for 2 years. Everything I've seen on her says she's independent and she's not connected to any of the political circles that would have Crane exposure. Can we get to her quietly? Quietly enough. Marcus paused. The question is whether she'll take a meeting with you specifically. given your specific profile. She'll take a meeting if Elena requests it. Damien looked at Elena. If you're willing to put your name on this. The weight of what he was asking was considerable, and he didn't pretend it wasn't. Elena had spent 4 years building a life on the premise of not putting her name on anything, of being as small and traceable as possible, of staying below the line of anything that would require her to stand up and be visible. She looked at the camera feeds, the patient vehicles, the men who were there to document her existence and build a story out of it whether she cooperated or not. She thought about the woman at the shelter who'd lost her job. She thought about Judith, somewhere unknown and hopefully safe. She thought about the other girls who'd been through the Mercer house, the ones she knew by name, the ones she didn't, the ones who'd been described as runaways. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. I'll put my name on it. Then we move tonight, Damien said, before those people outside get whatever they came for. He turned to Marcus and began giving instructions, and Elena stood in the center of his study and listened and understood that she had just made the decision she could not take back. Running was no longer the option. She had tried running. She had run for 4 years across 7 states, and it had brought her here, to this house, to this man, to this moment. And the moment had closed behind her like water over a stone, and there was nothing behind her anymore, only forward, whatever that meant. Outside, the 2 vehicles sat at the gate in the cold Maine dark, and the men in them were patient and professional and completely unaware that the woman they had come to document had just decided to stop being afraid of them. That decision, small and quiet as it was the thing that was going to destroy everything Victor Crane had spent 18 years building. He just didn't know it yet. They moved at 11:15. Marcus had spent 3 hours making the arrangements, and Damien had spent those same 3 hours sitting across from Elena at the kitchen island going through everything she could remember. Names, dates, locations, amounts she'd overheard, documents she'd seen. While she talked, and he listened and wrote nothing down, because paper was a liability, and he had a memory that had always worked better than most people's filing systems. She was a precise witness. That was the thing that struck him. Not emotional, not performative, precise. She gave him dates when she had them and approximate ranges when she didn't, and she flagged the difference each time without being asked. She told him what she'd seen directly and what she'd inferred, and she flagged that difference too. He had interviewed a lot of people in his life, in contexts that ranged from business negotiation to something considerably less comfortable, and he knew the difference between someone performing credibility and someone who simply had it. Elena had it. She'd had it for years, and it had done her no good because she'd had nobody to give it to. By the time Marcus knocked on the kitchen doorframe at 10:50, she had given Damien enough to understand the shape of the entire operation. Not every detail, not every name, but the architecture. The Mercer Foundation at the center, Victor Crane behind it, funding it, protecting it financially. A network of subsidiary organizations in 7 states that moved people, young people mostly, kids aging out of foster care or pulled from group homes or recruited from situations of extreme poverty into what was described publicly as job placement and vocational training, and was actually something else entirely. The money moved in one direction. The people moved in another. And at the far end of both chains, profits that were so thoroughly laundered by the time they reached Crane Capital Group's books that no surface audit would ever catch them. "The vehicles are gone," Marcus said from the doorframe. "Left about 40 minutes ago." "They got what they needed," Elena said. She wasn't asking. "Or they got called off because someone decided a different approach was better." Marcus looked at Damien. "Either way, the road's clear. We need to move before they reposition." The drive to Boston took just under 4 hours in the car Marcus had arranged. Not one of the estate's registered vehicles, a gray sedan with plates that traced to a legitimate rental registered to a name Damien used for situations like this. Carter drove. Marcus rode in front. Damien and Elena sat in the back with 18 inches of seat between them and the darkness of the Maine coastline moving past the windows. She slept for about 40 minutes, somewhere around the 2-hour mark. He didn't. He watched the road and thought about Victor Crane and the 2 transactions his real estate subsidiary had run through a Crane Capital affiliate 3 years ago, and he thought about how carefully that could be twisted, and he thought about what Marcus had said. That's elegant. It was. It was the kind of elegance that took years to construct and a very specific kind of intelligence to maintain. The intelligence of someone who understood that the best cover for a criminal operation was not invisibility, but legitimacy. And the best protection against exposure was having enough connections to redirect any investigation before it got traction. Elena woke up when the car slowed for a toll. She came awake fast and completely, the way people do when they've trained themselves to, and her hand moved toward the door handle before she registered where she was and stopped. "Still about an hour out," he said. She nodded, settled back. Her bandaged hands rested in her lap. "The investigator," she said. "Hargrove. How do we know she'll meet us tonight?" Marcus reached out through a channel she'd recognize as legitimate. She agreed to meet. He paused. She was cautious, which is either a good sign or a bad one, depending on why. Cautious because she's careful, or cautious because she already knows something and is deciding how to play it? That's the question. He looked at her. "What's your read when you meet someone? Generally?" She thought about it. "I watch what they do with their hands when they're listening, not when they're talking. Anyone can control what they do while they're talking, what they do while they're listening to something unexpected." "And what does that tell you?" "Whether they already knew what you were saying." She looked out the window. People who are actually surprised move differently than people who are managing a reaction. He filed that. "Then watch her hands." The meeting was set for a diner in Somerville, 40 minutes outside Boston proper. Open 24 hours, busy enough at 2 in the morning that 3 people in a corner booth didn't register as anything. Marcus had chosen it. Marcus chose most things logistically and was usually right. Special Agent Dana Hargrove was already there when they arrived. She was mid-40s, compact, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of face that had decided a long time ago to stop performing approachability. She had a coffee in front of her and her badge wallet on the table, flipped open. Not a threat, a clarification. She watched them come through the door, and her eyes moved across all 3 of them in about 2 seconds and settled on Elena. "Ms. Ashford," she said when Elena slid into the seat across from her. "You know my name," Elena said. "I know your name." Hargrove looked at Damien. "And I know yours." Back to Elena. "I've had a file on the Mercer Foundation for 14 months. Not a primary investigation, a secondary flag on a financial crimes case that branched in their direction and then went cold when the primary case collapsed." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "Someone in my office shut that branch down. I don't know who yet, but I've been watching for an opening." She paused. "When your associate reached out tonight and said you had information on the foundation's financial structure, I drove here directly from my apartment." Another pause. "I'm not here in an official capacity. I'm here because I want to know what you have before I decide how to move." Damien watched her hands while she talked. Elena was watching them too. He caught it in his peripheral vision, her eyes dropping to Hargrove's fingers around the coffee cup, tracking the pressure, the stillness. "Victor Crane," Elena said. Hargrove's hands did not move. Her face did not change. But something happened in her eyes, a focusing, a narrowing. The particular intensity of a person who has just heard a name they've been circling for a long time. She hadn't known, or she'd suspected and hadn't confirmed. Either way, her reaction was real. "Tell me everything," Hargrove said. Elena did. It took 40 minutes. Hargrove asked questions that were precise and well-constructed. The questions of someone who understood financial crime architecture, who knew which details mattered and which were noise. She didn't interrupt and she didn't lead and she wrote nothing down, same as Damien, same reason. When Elena finished, Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. "The documentation," she said. "You said there's physical documentation of the financial structure. Where?" "There's a woman named Judith," Elena said. "She took files when she left the foundation 11 years ago. I know what she took. She described them to me. Account records, transfer documentation, internal memos connecting the subsidiary organizations back to the foundation's main accounts. Enough to give a forensic accountant a starting point." She paused. "I don't know where Judith is right now, but I know how to reach her. If we can get those files into federal custody." "Into the right federal custody," Damien said. Hargrove looked at him. Yes, she said evenly. The right custody. A beat. I have two agents I trust with my life. Everyone else in my office is either connected to someone I can't verify, or they've been in place long enough that Crane's network could have exposure to them. She looked back at Elena. If we move on this, we move quiet. No official case filing until the documentation is in hand. Nothing on record until we're ready to act simultaneously. How long? Elena said. If I can get to Judith's files inside 48 hours, maybe 72 to be ready to move. Elena looked at Damien. He held her gaze and gave her the decision with his eyes, which was the only thing he could give her. It was her risk, her name, her choice. I'll contact Judith tonight, Elena said. They were back in the car by 3 a.m, heading north. Elena had her phone out and was composing a message to an address Damien hadn't seen before. A contact method she'd been holding in reserve, something she hadn't used in over a year. He watched her compose it with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that every word was consequential. She sent it, put the phone face down on her knee. How'd she seem to you? She said. Clean, he said. Her reaction to Crane's name was genuine. I thought so too. A pause. Her hands were still when I named the subsidiaries. That's the part she already knew. When I described the internal financial structure, the way the accounts were layered, that's when her grip changed. She was quiet for a moment. She's been looking at the outside of this thing for a year and a half. We just showed her the inside. That makes her more useful or more dangerous, Damien said, depending on what she does with it. Both, Elena said. Probably both. The response from Judith came at 4:47 in the morning. Elena was dozing again when her phone lit up on her knee, and she came awake and read it, and was very still for a moment that was one beat too long. What? Damien said. She turned the phone so he could read it. The message was short, 6 words and an address. They found me. Come get them. The address was in Providence, Rhode Island. They made it to Providence in under 2 hours. The address was a storage facility on the industrial east side of the city, the kind of place that rents units by the month to people who don't want to explain what they're storing. Marcus drove. Damien had made 3 calls on the way down, quiet and fast, and had 2 of his people already on site by the time the sedan pulled into the facility's lot. The unit was in the back row. The rolling door was down but unlocked. Inside, in a folding chair with a bag on her lap and a bruise darkening along her left jaw, was a woman in her late 50s who looked at Elena the moment she came through the door and let out a breath that seemed to have been held for years. Judith, Elena said. You look older, Judith said. Her voice was hoarse. Not bad. Just older. She'd been found 2 days ago, not grabbed. She'd spotted the surveillance before they could move on her, which meant she'd been watching for it, which meant she'd been watching for it for 11 years and was still sharp enough to make them when they showed up. She'd moved immediately, taken the bag she kept packed. Come here. The bag had the files. She'd been sitting in this storage unit for 41 hours. She had a phone she'd bought with cash the previous morning. She had not called anyone except Elena. Damien looked at the bag. Judith looked at Damien with the frank assessment of someone who had spent years reading people in the context of how dangerous they were. You're Calloway, she said. Yes. I know your name. Not from her, from the Foundation's records. 3 years ago, a real estate transaction through a Crane Capital subsidiary. She watched his face. Crane flagged your name, not as a concern, as an asset, a potential liability he could activate if he needed to create a story. Her jaw was tight. He's been holding that connection in reserve for a situation exactly like this one. The storage unit was cold and smelled of concrete and old cardboard, and Damien stood in it with this information settling across his shoulders like weight being loaded deliberately, piece by piece. He set it up 3 years ago, Damien said. Not quite a question. The transaction was real, Judith said. He does that. Runs legitimate business alongside everything else so the connections are genuine. Harder to dispute. She opened the bag on her lap. But the documentation I have shows that the subsidiary you transacted through was used 6 months after your deal closed to move Foundation money. The paper trail puts your company's name in proximity to a transaction chain that connects back to trafficking proceeds. She looked at him steadily. Any prosecutor looking at it cold would have questions. Any prosecutor looking at it with Crane's assistance would have more than questions, Marcus said from the doorway. Yes. Judith pulled a folder from the bag, which is why this needs to go somewhere that Crane can't reach before it goes anywhere official. Elena had been standing just inside the door, watching Judith, watching Damien, running her own calculations. Now she spoke. Hargrove, she said. We take it directly to Hargrove. Who's Hargrove? Judith said. Federal investigator. Financial crimes. She's been watching the Foundation from the outside for a year and a half. Judith was quiet for a moment. Then, Dana Hargrove? Something in the air in the unit shifted. Elena registered it before she could name it. You know her? Damien said. I know the name. Judith's voice had changed. The hoarseness was still there, but something else had entered it. A careful quality, a slowing down. She ran an investigation into a shell organization in Connecticut 4 years ago. The investigation collapsed. The file was officially closed due to insufficient evidence. She paused. The shell organization she was investigating was one of ours. Foundation connected. Another pause. The investigation collapsed 2 weeks after it opened because someone inside the Boston field office received information that redirected the focus of the inquiry. The information came from a source that was never officially identified. Nobody spoke. Elena's hands had gone cold inside the bandages. She pressed them flat against her thighs and felt the pressure without the warmth. Are you saying Hargrove shut down her own investigation? Damien said. I'm saying the investigation shut down 2 weeks after she opened it, and I don't know why. Judith's voice was precise and exhausted and honest. I'm saying that's a fact I have documented, and I don't have an explanation for it, and I have learned in 11 years of watching this organization operate that facts without explanations are the most dangerous kind. She looked at Elena. I'm not saying she's dirty. I'm saying I don't know. Elena stood in the cold storage unit and felt the architecture of the last 6 hours reconstruct itself around this new piece of information, and what it built was not a plan. It was a trap. They had gone to Hargrove at 2 in the morning and laid out the entire case, every name, every connection, Victor Crane, the financial structure, Judith's existence, and the files she carried. They had given all of it to a woman who might be the most honest investigator in the Boston field office, or might be the reason a Foundation-connected investigation had died in 2 weeks 4 years ago. She knows about Judith, Elena said. Her voice came out flat and strange in her own ears. I told her. I told her everything. Damien's face had gone very still. I told her Judith had files, Elena said. I told her I could reach Judith. I told her we'd contact her tonight. She stopped. Her throat was tight. And Judith sent me that message at 4:47 in the morning, 2 hours after our meeting ended. The timeline sat in the air between all of them. Judith looked at Elena. How long before you got here after I messaged? 2 hours. Then whoever found me, whoever sent people here, they had my location before you did. Judith's voice was absolutely level, the voice of someone who has survived by never panicking. I spotted the car outside this facility 20 minutes before your vehicle arrived. They weren't moving yet. I think they were waiting. She looked at Damien. Waiting for you. A documentation team. That was what Damien saw immediately. Not an extraction. A documentation team. People with cameras and logs. Waiting to record Damien Calloway arriving at a storage facility at 6 in the morning to collect files from a woman who'd fled the Mercer Foundation. With Elena Ashford, the woman who'd been living in his house for 11 days. The photographs would show what they showed, and someone who knew what story to tell with those photographs could make them say almost anything. We need to move the files, Damien said, right now, not to Hargrove. Then where? Marcus said. Marcus, somewhere that isn't here and isn't connected to anything Hargrove heard last night. He was already moving toward Judith. Can you walk? I've been sitting in a folding chair for 41 hours, Judith said, standing up with the bag clutched to her chest. I can run if I have to. They moved. Carter had the car at the facility's rear exit, Marcus had identified it when they arrived, because Marcus always identified exits. Judith went in first, then Elena, then Damien. Marcus pulled the rolling door of the storage unit down behind them as they went, and by the time they were out of the lot and onto the street heading east, the car that had been parked outside the facility's front entrance, and there was a car, they all saw it, dark blue sedan, no visible occupants, had not moved. Watching. Recording. "Tell me you have someone clean," Elena said. She was looking at Damien. Her voice was controlled but stripped of everything except the question. "Tell me you have one person on the federal side who Crane hasn't touched and Hargrove doesn't know about." Damien was quiet for a moment. 1 moment, 2, and the silence had the particular quality of a man who is looking at the options and counting what's left. "There might be someone," he said, "but going to them means putting my own history in the room. Everything I've done, it means asking a federal agent to look past what I am." "Can they?" "I don't know." "Then find out." She held his eyes. "Because right now we have files that implicate Victor Crane, and we can't trust the investigator who knows we have them, and there are people documenting our location, and Hargrove is either going to call Crane in the next few hours or she already has." Her voice cracked, just barely, just at the edge, one syllable of it fracturing before she brought it back under control. "I am done running. I told you that. But running is the only thing I know how to do, and if you don't have something better, I am going to have to choose between the thing that keeps me alive and the thing that actually ends this." The car was quiet. Providence moving past the windows, the early morning light starting gray and reluctant over the rooftops. Damien picked up his phone, scrolled to a name he had never used for anything like this. A name he'd held in reserve for a situation he'd always hoped wouldn't arrive. He looked at the name for a moment. The weight of making this call, of what it would require him to give up, and what it would require him to admit, sat in his chest like something physical. He pressed call. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, tired, alert, wary in the specific way of someone who knows that calls at 6 in the morning are never good news. "Calloway," the voice said, "this better be important." "It is," Damien said. "I need to meet. Today. And I need you to come without telling anyone in your office where you're going." A long pause on the other end. "That's a significant ask." "I know what I'm asking." He looked at Elena. "I have a witness, physical documentation, and a federal investigator who may have just burned our entire case to a man who's been running a trafficking network for 20 years. He paused. "And I need someone who can put me in the same room as all of that without arresting me on sight." Another pause. Longer. "Where?" the voice said. And Damien told him, and the shape of the next 12 hours assembled itself around that answer like a structure being built in real time over nothing but the thin, cold certainty that there was no version of this that didn't require walking directly toward the thing that could destroy them both. The man on the phone was named Robert Hess. He was 53 years old, a supervisory special agent with the FBI's Organized Crime Division out of the New York field office. And he and Damien Calloway had a history that neither of them had ever put on paper, and neither of them would ever fully acknowledge in a room with witnesses. 7 years ago, Hess had been building a case against a mid-level trafficking operation working the Connecticut shoreline. The operation's financial structure had been deliberately obscured: shell companies, false invoices, the usual architecture. And Hess had been stalled for 8 months on a single question. Where was the money coming from before it entered the shell structure? Damien had answered that question. Not officially. Not in any way that could be traced or cited or entered into evidence. He'd passed a name through Marcus to a contact of Hess's, and the name had cracked the case open, and 11 people had been arrested, and 7 of them were still in federal prison. Hess had never asked why Damien helped, and Damien had never explained, and the debt between them had sat unacknowledged and unresolved for 7 years like a stone in still water. Damien was calling it in now. Hess drove up from New York alone, as requested. He arrived at the hotel in downtown Providence at 8:15 in the morning, a compact man in a gray suit that needed pressing, with the face of someone who had spent 30 years looking at things most people preferred not to know about, and had come to a functional peace with that. He looked at Marcus in the hallway outside the room and nodded once, and looked at Carter and said nothing and came into the room. He looked at Judith first, at the bag on her lap and the bruise on her jaw and the 11 years of vigilance behind her eyes. Then he looked at Elena. He looked at her the way Hargrove had looked at her in the diner, the immediate focusing, the recognition of someone who'd been a name in a file and was now a person in a room. But where Hargrove's attention had been strategic, clinical, Hess's was something else. It had weight to it, like he was accounting for what he was seeing. "Ms. Ashford," he said. "Agent Hess." He sat down across from all three of them, Elena, Judith, Damien arranged on one side of the small hotel table, and he put his hands flat on the table and looked at Damien. "You said Hargrove," he said. "I said she might have burned us. I'm not certain. I know Dana Hargrove." His voice was even. "I've known her for 12 years. She's not dirty." "That investigation 4 years ago. I know about that investigation." Hess's jaw tightened, barely. "I know it collapsed. I looked into it at the time and got nowhere, and I've wondered about it since." He looked at Judith. "You have documentation connecting that collapse to Foundation interference?" "I have documentation that the target of that investigation was Foundation connected, and that the investigation's collapse coincided with the timing of a communication I can trace between a Foundation attorney and someone in the Boston field office." Judith's voice was steady. "Whether that someone was Hargrove or someone adjacent to her, I don't know. The documentation shows the communication happened. It doesn't show who received it." Hess was quiet for a moment, processing. "The files. What specifically do you have?" Judith opened the bag. She spread it across the table piece by piece. Physical documents, printed records, pages that had been folded and refolded until the creases were worn soft. Account statements, transfer records, internal memos on Mercer Foundation letterhead connecting subsidiary organizations to the main accounts. A hand-drawn diagram she'd made herself 11 years ago when she first understood what she was looking at, showing the money flow from Crane Capital through 4 layers of shell structure into the Foundation and back out again. Hess looked at each piece. He didn't rush. He picked up the transfer records and went through them page by page, and his face stayed neutral and professional, and only his eyes moved, tracking amounts, dates, account numbers, with the intensity of someone for whom these documents meant something specific and actionable. "This is enough," he said finally. "Not for a conviction, not on its own, but for a warrant. A real warrant, with enough specificity that a judge can't water it down." He looked at Elena. "Your testimony supporting this documentation is what makes it prosecutable, rather than just suggestive." "I'll testify," Elena said. "It means being visible. Your name on record, subpoenas, depositions, the full process." "I know what it means." He held her gaze. "Crane has resources. He'll attack your credibility. He'll find everything he can in your history and put it on a table in front of a jury." "I know." Her voice didn't waver. "There's nothing in my history that wasn't put there by the people I'm testifying against. Let them show it." Hess looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. "All right." He started to gather the documents back into careful order. "I need to make 3 calls. My 2 people in Boston, agents I trust completely, and a federal judge I've worked with for 9 years who will sign a warrant at 9 in the morning without needing to know the full context, because she trusts my judgment on timing." He paused. "The question is Hargrove. If she's clean, we need to bring her in before she does something that accidentally burns the case. If she's not, Damien said, she's already on the phone with Crane." A silence. The hotel room hummed around them. The ventilation system, traffic from the street below, the specific compressed silence of 4 people calculating probability. "What time did your meeting with her end?" Hess said. 2:50 approximately, Elena said. Hess looked at his watch. 5 hours and 20 minutes. If she was going to call Crane immediately, she'd have done it before sunrise. He stood up. "I need to reach her before she moves on her own. If she's clean, she's sitting on this information and burning to act on it, and that's dangerous in a different way. He picked up his phone. Stay in this room. Don't use your personal phones. Don't call anyone. He stepped into the bathroom and closed the door. Elena looked at the table where the documents had been, at the cleared surface where 11 years of Judith's survival had been laid out and gathered up again. Her hands were in her lap, and she was very still. And Damien watched her from across the table and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Judith poured herself water from the bottle on the nightstand and drank half of it in one long pull and set it down. "You doing all right?" she said to Elena. Not gently, practically, the way a person asks who has learned that gentleness is a luxury that can wait. "I don't know yet," Elena said. "That's honest." Judith looked at the bathroom door. "He's good?" "He better be," Elena said. Hess came out of the bathroom in 12 minutes. His face had the quality of someone who has just run a very fast calculation and landed on a result that changes the plan. "Hargrove's clean," he said. "She spent the last 3 hours trying to reach me independently. She had concerns about the meeting, something about your reaction when she mentioned the Connecticut investigation. She said you went still in a way that bothered her. And she's been trying to reach someone she trusts outside her office to flag it." He looked at Damien. "She didn't call Crane. She called my office in New York and left a message for me specifically, which is why I had 3 messages waiting when I got here and didn't check them until just now." "Then she's in," Damien said. "She's in. She's driving to Providence right now." A pause. "And she has something she didn't tell you last night. There's a federal building in Boston, a secure records annex, where evidence from 2 collapsed investigations has been stored for years. She's had a flag on the file for 14 months. If we can coordinate the warrant with a simultaneous move on that building, we protect the existing evidence while we execute the new warrant." "How fast can you move?" Damien said. "The warrant, 2 hours, maybe 3. The coordinated action." He stopped. "There's a problem. To execute simultaneously, I need agents moving on the Mercer Foundation, on Crane Capital, and on the records annex at exactly the same time. If any piece moves before the others, Crane has enough connections to get a call." He looked around the room. "I need 6 people I trust inside a 2-hour window, and 4 of them need to be in Boston." "I have people in Boston," Damien said. Hess looked at him. "I can't use your people for a federal action." "You're not using them for a federal action. You're using them to hold a position until your people arrive." Damien held his gaze. "I know how to run logistics. Tell me what you need and where." The next 2 hours were the most compressed Elena had ever experienced. Hess on the phone in rotating 15-minute cycles, stepping in and out of the bathroom, his voice a controlled, low murmur through the door. Damien at the small desk with Marcus beside him. Moving pieces, people, vehicles, positions. With the quiet efficiency of someone who had built an organization that operated in exactly these margins, except that what he was building now was pointed in the opposite direction from everything he'd built before. Judith sat on the edge of the bed with the bag between her feet and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, the particular stillness of someone who has been surviving in small rooms for so long that waiting is just another form of motion. Elena stood at the window. She watched the street below. The Providence morning assembling itself. Early workers, delivery trucks. A woman walking a dog with the determined pace of someone doing the first necessary thing of the day. Ordinary life conducting itself at a normal volume directly below a hotel room where something was happening that would either end a 20-year criminal enterprise or get them all arrested by noon. Hargrove arrived at 9:40. She knocked twice, specific rhythm, the one Hess had told her. Marcus opened the door. She came in and she looked at Elena immediately, and Elena looked back at her, and neither of them said anything about the meeting in the diner or what had happened after it. "I owe you an explanation," Hargrove said. "Later," Elena said. "After." Hargrove nodded. Something in her face. Not quite relief, but the nearest available thing. The warrant came through at 10:17. Hess read it on his phone and then set the phone face up on the table and looked at everyone in the room and said, simply, "We move." What followed was not elegant. Nothing at this scale was ever elegant. Hess's 2 Boston agents, a man named Teller and a woman named Park, both of whom arrived at the hotel at 10:30, having driven up from Boston on Hess's call at 8 in the morning, took Judith and the documents in a federal vehicle heading directly back to Boston for the records annex. The annex was the most exposed piece. If Crane had any warning at all, that was where he'd send someone first, to the stored evidence from the 2 collapsed investigations, the files that corroborated everything Judith had carried for 11 years. Hargrove and 2 of her own trusted agents moved on Crane Capital Group's Boston offices. Hess went to the Mercer Foundation. Damien's people held positions at 3 points around both locations, not intervening, not visible, just present, in the specific way that people trained in the logistics of violence are present, available, watching, ready to do exactly what they were told and nothing more. Elena went with Hess. He'd argued against it for about 90 seconds, and she had made her case in flat, precise sentences, and he'd looked at her and at Damien and made the calculation that she was going to be more dangerous unsupervised than present, and he'd said fine. The Mercer Foundation occupied the top 2 floors of a building in Cambridge, a clean, modern space with the kind of considered tasteful design that communicated legitimacy without trying too hard. They went in at 11:08, Hess and 2 federal agents and Elena, and the woman at the front desk stood up when she saw them and said, "May I help you?" in the reflexive way of someone trained in professional obstruction, and Hess showed his badge and the warrant and said, "We're going to need everyone to step away from their workstations." Patricia Mercer was in the back office. Elena knew she was there before they reached the door because she could hear her. The voice, that particular voice, the one she'd heard in her nightmares for 4 years. Patricia was on the phone, speaking in the measured, controlled tones of someone who had just received a warning call and was managing the next 30 seconds very carefully. The agent beside Hess opened the door. Patricia Mercer was 61 years old, and she looked exactly like her photographs. Silver hair, expensive clothes, the face of a woman who had spent 30 years being photographed at charity dinners and knew exactly what angle the camera liked. She looked at Hess, at the badge, at the warrant he placed on her desk, and something moved behind her eyes that was not fear exactly, but was fear's nearest functional cousin. Then she saw Elena. The shift in her face when she registered Elena was a thing Elena had been trying to prepare herself for, and had not managed to prepare for completely, because Patricia Mercer's face when she was managing a situation looked like one thing, and Patricia Mercer's face when that management failed looked like something else entirely, something rawer and older, something that had been behind the philanthropy and the magazine profiles and the family for 30 years and had never been meant to be visible. She ended the call without saying goodbye. "Eleanor?" she said. "Don't," Elena said. "You don't understand what you're—" "I understand exactly what I'm doing." Her voice was level, perfectly level. She'd thought it would shake, and it didn't. "I've understood it for 4 years. I've been waiting until I had someone to give it to." Patricia looked at Hess. "I want my attorney." "Absolutely," Hess said. "You'll have access to counsel. Right now, I need you to step away from the desk and not touch your phone." Patricia stepped away from the desk. Her eyes stayed on Elena, and Elena held them. And the thing passing between the 2 of them in that moment was old and heavy and had been building since Elena was 12 years old and had finally, in this office, at this moment, run out of room to keep building. Elena's phone buzzed. She pulled it out. A message from Marcus. "Problem at the annex. Someone's already inside." Her stomach dropped. She showed it to Hess without a word. His face hardened. He looked at the agent handling Patricia and said, "Stay here. Do not let her touch anything." And he stepped into the hallway with Elena and made a call. Teller picked up on the first ring. "We're at the annex. Someone got here before us. Not federal, civilian credentials, facility access card. They're in the evidence storage section right now." "How long have they been inside?" Hess said. 14 minutes. Maybe 15. Hess looked at Elena. 14 minutes was enough time to damage a significant portion of a stored file if you knew what you were looking for. "I'm going," Elena said. "That is not—" "Teller can't touch him without jurisdiction over the specific files, and you know it." She was already moving toward the elevator. "I have standing as a witness with documentation in hand. I can walk in there and confront him directly, and everything he says to me is recordable." She stopped at the elevator and looked back at Hess. Tell Teller to let me in and stay out of the way. Hess stared at her for 2 seconds. 2 full seconds of a man running probability against the knowledge that she was right about the jurisdiction problem, that Teller was at the door of the annex and couldn't execute a seizure on the internal evidence files without a specific supplemental order that would take another hour to generate. Go, he said. Marcus's driver is outside. I'll call Teller. She was in the car in 90 seconds. The Federal Records Annex was 6 minutes away, and she spent those 6 minutes with her hands pressing down on her thighs and her eyes on the buildings moving past the window, and her brain running every version of what she was about to walk into, none of which ended cleanly. The annex was a gray municipal building, understated, the kind of building that communicated nothing, because communicating nothing was the point. Teller was at the front door, a lean man in his 30s who looked at her with the expression of someone who has received complicated instructions very recently and is following them under protest. He's on the 3rd floor, Teller said. He knows we're here. He hasn't tried to leave. What's he doing? From what security can see on the camera, going through files. Selectively. Taking photographs with his phone. Taking photographs, not destroying. Photographing? Copying the evidence to send somewhere before he walked out. Before anyone could prove what he'd done in here. She understood immediately. Destroying evidence in a federal building was a felony with no ambiguity. Photographing it and sending it to someone who would use it to preemptively counter the investigation, that was murkier. Harder to prosecute. The kind of move Victor Crane would design. She went up the stairs. The 3rd floor was a long corridor of secured rooms, each one holding archived case files behind locked glass doors. The 3rd door on the right was open. The man inside was 40-something, in a suit that said attorney, with a phone in one hand and an open file box on the table in front of him. He heard her come in and turned around, and Elena saw his face and recognized it. Not from a personal encounter, from a photograph. Foundation records, one of the Foundation's attorneys. His name was Stern, she thought. She'd seen his name on documents. He looked at her. He looked at the door she'd come through. He looked back at her. You should leave, he said. Put the phone down, she said. You don't have any authority here. I have standing as a documented witness to the financial crimes in those files. She stepped into the room. Her heart was hitting her ribs hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, but her voice stayed flat and she kept moving. And every movement you make in this room from the moment you walked in has been recorded by the facility's security system. She stopped 3 feet from him. You've already photographed some of it. I can't undo that. But you're going to put that phone on this table right now and step back, and federal agents are going to come up here and take it. And whatever you sent in the last 14 minutes is going to be traceable, and Crane is going to have to explain why his attorney was photographing evidence files in a federal annex the same morning federal agents executed a warrant on his offices. Stern looked at her. His jaw was tight. His hand on the phone was tight. She watched his knuckles, the way his grip adjusted, and she knew he was calculating whether she was bluffing, and she knew she couldn't let him spend too long on that calculation. Victor Crane is being arrested right now, she said. It wasn't certain. She didn't know where Hargrove's team was on Crane specifically, but she said it with the precision and flatness of established fact, and she watched it hit him, watched the calculation in his face shift from, can I get out of this, to what does this cost me if I stay? His hand opened. The phone clattered onto the table. She picked it up, locked it, put it in her jacket pocket. Her hands were shaking inside the bandages, and she pressed her palms flat against her sides and held them there. Behind her, she heard Teller's footsteps on the stairs. Stern sat down on the edge of the table with the particular posture of a man whose legs have quietly stopped cooperating, and he looked at the open file box in front of him, and then he looked at Elena. And what passed through his face in that moment was something she would remember for a long time. Not remorse exactly, but the expression of a person who has built his life on the assumption that a certain architecture of power would always hold, and who has just, in the span of about 90 seconds, watched that assumption fail. They'll argue everything you have, he said. His voice had gone flat. Every file, every transfer record. Crane has 4 attorneys who specialize in financial obfuscation, and they will spend 2 years picking apart the chain of evidence, and they will find every gap and every inconsistency. I know, Elena said, and you'll be in the middle of all of it. Your entire history, I know. Then why? Because I'm done, she said. I'm done with this being the thing that happened to me that no one ever paid for. Her voice was still flat, completely controlled. That's why. Teller came through the door with his badge already out and his partner behind him, and Elena stepped back and let them take the room, and she walked out into the corridor and stood against the wall with her back to the cool plaster and her eyes on the ceiling and her hands pressed flat at her sides. Downstairs, her phone buzzed. Marcus. One sentence. Hargrove has Crane. Boston office. He's in custody. She read it twice. Her eyes were dry. She thought she might cry, and she didn't. Not because the feeling wasn't there, but because it was too large for that particular release, too heavy and old and complicated to come out as something as simple as tears. She texted back, "Files are secure, Stern is in custody. I have his phone." Then she stood in the third-floor corridor of a federal records annex in Boston and breathed. In and out. The particular kind of breathing you do when something enormous has stopped moving, and the silence after it is so complete it has its own weight. Her phone buzzed again. Damien this time. Where are you? She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, "Still standing. You?" His response came in under 10 seconds. "Same. Come back." She pushed off the wall, rolled her shoulders back, walked toward the stairs with her hands no longer pressed to her sides but hanging loose at her thighs, and the shaking in them had mostly stopped, and the corridor was quiet, and somewhere 2 floors below her the ordinary work of a federal building was continuing at its ordinary volume, completely unaware that what had just happened in one of its third-floor archive rooms had been the last piece of something 20 years in the making finally being put in place. She reached the top of the stairwell and stopped. Below her, she could hear Teller's voice giving instructions, and Stern's attorney voice beginning its professional recalibration toward whatever story was going to replace the one that had just collapsed. And further, distantly, through the building's walls, the city moving at its ordinary speed, traffic, voices, the persistent sound of life that continues regardless of what any individual life is doing. She put her foot on the top stair, and she went down. The safety flag here is for a fiction screenplay. The self-harm references in this story are character backstory details established in Part 1, not first-person disclosures. Proceeding with the creative task. The testimony took 11 days. Not all at once, it never was. It came in sessions, each one scheduled and structured and conducted in a conference room in the federal building in Boston that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and recycled air, with Hess on one side of the table and 2 assistant U.S. attorneys on the other, and Elena in the middle, and a recorder running and a stenographer whose fingers moved so fast and so quietly that Elena sometimes forgot she was there. Elena told it chronologically. Hess had asked her to, and she understood why. Chronology was the frame that made everything else hang correctly, that gave the jury, eventually, a way to follow what would otherwise be an overwhelming mass of names and dates and financial architecture. She started at 8 years old, which was where her documented life began, and she moved forward from there 1 year at a time, and she told what she knew directly and what she'd inferred, and she flagged the difference every time. And on the 3rd day, one of the assistant U.S. attorneys, a woman named Chen who was rigorous and careful and had the particular quality of someone who believed in what she was doing without being naive about it, stopped her mid-sentence and said, "Ms. Ashford, I want you to know that what you're doing here is the most complete and precise witness testimony I've taken in 14 years. Elena looked at her. "I've been preparing it for 4 years, she said. "I had time to get it right." Chen nodded once. They kept going. On the 5th day, Gerald Mercer's attorney filed a motion to suppress Elena's testimony on the grounds that she was an unreliable witness due to psychological instability resulting from her years in foster care. The motion was 22 pages long and referenced 3 psychiatric frameworks and cited a filing from a doctor Elena had never met or spoken to. Elena read it the same evening Hess delivered it to her. She sat in the kitchen of the hotel suite they'd moved her to. A different hotel, different city, federal protection for the duration, and she read all 22 pages with a cup of tea going cold beside her. And when she finished, she set it face down on the table and sat for a moment looking at the window. Damien was across the table. He'd been there for most of the evenings of the testimony period, driving down from Maine or up from wherever his own legal situation required his presence, which was complicated and ongoing, but as of the warrant's execution, structured around cooperation rather than prosecution. The terms of that cooperation were between him and Hess and a set of federal attorneys, and Elena had not asked about the specifics because some rooms she understood she didn't need to be in. "They're going to try to make you the story," he said. He said it looking at the table, not at her. Not cruel, just factual, preparing her for what he already knew was coming. "I know." She picked up the motion and set it aside. "They've been trying to make me the story for 4 years. They never had an audience before. Now they do. Now they do." She wrapped both hands around the cold cup. "It's not going to work, because the documentation doesn't come from me. Judith's files exist independent of my testimony. The financial records exist independent of my testimony. Stern's phone, whatever he managed to send before I got there, and whatever he didn't manage to send, that's all independent of me." She looked at Damien. "They can attack my credibility all they want. What they can't do is explain the money." He looked at her for a moment. The kitchen light was harsh and flat, and it showed everything. The lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples that had been more pronounced since the morning in Providence, the particular tiredness of a man who had spent the last 2 weeks operating at a level of sustained intensity that leaves marks. "You should sleep," he said. "You should too. I'm not the one giving testimony in the morning." "No," she said. "You're just the one who arranged the federal cooperation that made the testimony possible and is currently negotiating his own legal exposure while running his organization and driving 4 hours round trip every other day." She paused. "One of us should probably sleep." Something moved through his face that was close to a smile. Not quite. Adjacent. "I'll sleep when this is over," he said. "That's what I've been saying for 4 years." The motion to suppress was denied on day 7. The judge was brief and precise in her ruling. The motion's psychiatric framework was speculative and unsubstantiated, and the witness's documented history, rather than undermining her credibility, directly corroborated the substance of her testimony. The ruling was 2 paragraphs. Elena read it standing in the corridor outside the conference room and handed it back to Chen without comment. On day 9, Victor Crane's lead attorney appeared at the federal building and requested a meeting with the prosecution team. Elena was not in that meeting. She was told about it afterward, in the clipped, careful language of attorneys managing information flow. Crane was considering a cooperation agreement. He was prepared to provide financial documentation connecting the Mercer Foundation subsidiary network to 3 additional trafficking operations in 2 other states, in exchange for reduced charges on the central conspiracy counts. Elena sat with this information for a long time after Chen delivered it. "He's going to help you prosecute the people he built the network with," she said. "In exchange for a significantly reduced sentence, yes. And you're taking it." Chen looked at her carefully. "The additional operations he's identified have active victims, people currently in those networks who can be reached and helped because of the information he provides." A pause. "It's not a clean trade, but it's the trade that does the most good." Elena was quiet. She looked at the wall, at the framed federal seal on the conference room wall that she'd been looking at for 9 days. "What does he get?" she said. "Specifically, federal charges reduced to a single count of financial conspiracy. Probable sentence of 8 to 12 years with cooperation credit. He'll be out in 6. 6 years. For 20 years of what she knew he'd been part of. The math of it sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. "Okay," she said. "Ms. Ashford, I said okay." She looked at Chen. "I understand why. I don't have to like it to understand why." She straightened in her chair. "What else do you need from me today?" On day 11, she gave her final statement. It was shorter than the preceding sessions, a structured summary, pulling together the threads, giving the record a clean closing shape. She spoke for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and when she finished, the room was quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet at the beginning of each session. A settled quality. The quiet of something completed. Hess walked her out of the building. They stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, and he looked at her with the direct, unperformed attention she'd come to associate with him. "You did that well," he said. "I had 11 years of accumulation to draw from." "That's not what I mean." He paused. "Most witnesses, even good witnesses, even truthful ones, they perform it somewhat. The emotion, the framing. You didn't. You just told it." She thought about why that was. The answer was simple and not entirely comfortable. She'd told it so many times in her own head, in the dark of so many rooms in so many cities over 4 years, that the performance had been burned off long ago. What was left was just the thing itself. "What happens now?" she said. "Procedurally. Arraignment for Gerald and Patricia Mercer is next week. Crane's cooperation agreement requires formal approval, which takes another 2 to 3 weeks. The Foundation's assets are frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. That process will take months, but it's moving." He put his hands in his coat pockets against the cold. "There are parallel investigations opening in 2 other states based on Crane's initial cooperation. Those will move on their own timelines." And Hargrove. Back in her office. The investigation into the Connecticut collapse, the one that shuttered 4 years ago, it's been reopened with a different team. We'll know in a few months whether someone in the Boston field office received money or whether it was something less direct. Either way, it won't be swept. He looked at her. "She asked me to tell you she was sorry, for the meeting in the diner, for not telling you about the Connecticut connection up front. She was being careful." "She was. She said you'd say that." Elena looked at the street. Traffic moving, people moving, a city doing its ordinary business in the November gray. "Tell her it's fine," she said. "Tell her I'm glad she was there." Hess nodded. He extended his hand and she shook it. Her bandaged right hand, though the bandages were different now, thinner, the wounds mostly healed. He held it a moment longer than a standard handshake. "What happens to you now?" he said. She thought about it. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the first time in 4 years I've been able to say that and have it mean something good." He let go of her hand, nodded once, went back inside. She stood on the sidewalk for another minute, alone, the cold working through her jacket in the specific way of New England November, the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. Then she turned and walked to the car where Marcus was waiting, and she got in, and they drove north. The sentencing happened in February. Gerald Mercer received 22 years. He stood in the courtroom and looked at the judge and said nothing, and his attorney said nothing useful. And his face, when the sentence was read, had a quality Elena had not expected. Not devastation, not rage, but a kind of blankness, as if some interior structure had simply given way under its own weight, and what was left was just a man, ordinary and diminished, standing in a room. Patricia Mercer received 19 years. She looked at Elena when the sentence was read. Elena looked back. Patricia's face was the face she'd known since she was 12. Composed, controlled, giving almost nothing away. But her hands, clasped in front of her at the defense table, were pressed together so hard that her knuckles had gone white, and Elena watched those hands and understood. Patricia Mercer was afraid, not of the sentence or not primarily. She was afraid of Elena having survived, which was the thing she'd built 20 years of careful structure to prevent, and which had happened anyway, and which was now permanent and documented and entirely beyond her ability to manage. Elena held her gaze until Patricia looked away. Then she looked at the ceiling of the courtroom and breathed. Afterward, in the courthouse corridor, Judith found her. Judith had been there for the sentencing, sitting in the public gallery 3 rows back, and she came out into the corridor and they stood together without saying anything for a moment. 2 women who had known each other in one specific terrible context and had survived it separately and come back around to standing in the same corridor again, older. 22 years, Judith said. Yes. Is it enough? Elena considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. It's not about enough, she said finally. Enough was never on the table. What was on the table was whether it happened at all. She looked at Judith. It happened. Judith nodded slowly. She had the look of someone integrating a large thing in real time, finding places in themselves to put something that doesn't fit standard storage. I've been thinking about what to do next, she said. I have 11 years of expertise in how these financial structures work, how they hide. Someone should probably be using that. Talk to Chen, Elena said. She'll know who to point you to. Will you? Elena looked at her. I'm already doing something, she said. I'll tell you about it. But talk to Chen first. Judith looked at her for a moment with the direct, unglamorous attention of someone who has been studying people's trustworthiness for 11 years as a survival mechanism. Then she nodded, pulled her coat tighter, walked toward the courthouse doors. Elena watched her go. Oh, the nonprofit took 6 months to build from the ground up. Not because it was complicated. Elena had help, significant help, from an attorney Marcus found who specialized in nonprofit structure and a grant consultant who donated the first 80 hours of her time, and a financial advisor who set up the organizational accounts with the kind of meticulousness that made Elena feel, every time she reviewed the books, like the opposite of everything the Mercer Foundation had ever been. She named it Forward Document. The name was deliberate, bureaucratic sounding enough to not attract attention in grant databases, specific enough to mean something to the people it was built for. It served one population, young adults aging out of foster care who had been in systems connected to trafficking operations, or who showed indicators of having been targeted. It did not do everything. It did specific things: emergency legal assistance, help rebuilding documentation for people whose identities had been assigned or corrupted, connection to verified safe housing. It did those things well and carefully and without performing rescue, because Elena had been performed rescue at enough times to know what it felt like from the receiving end, and it felt like being an object in someone else's story. Forward Document treated its clients like people with specific problems that had specific solutions, and it treated their intelligence and their agency as givens rather than as things to be developed. That was the whole philosophy. It fit on one page of the organizational charter, and Elena had written it herself and had not changed a word of it. She ran it from an office in Portland, Maine. She drove to the estate on weekends, most weekends, along the coastal road that she'd learned was actually beautiful when you weren't moving along it at 2 a.m. with federal complications in the back seat. The water was gray or blue depending on the season, and the rocks were old and permanent, and the light hit them differently at different times of day in ways she'd started to notice because she had time now, actual discretionary time, time that belonged to her in the specific way that time only belongs to you when you're not spending all of it surviving. Damien's legal situation had resolved in the spring. Resolved was the word his attorney used, which was the word attorneys used for outcomes that were not clean but were concluded. His cooperation with Hess's investigation had been factored. His exposure had been carefully bounded. He remained what he was, which was complicated, which was not something Elena tried to simplify in her own mind because oversimplifying it would require her to be dishonest about the full shape of what she knew about him. And she had enough experience with dishonesty organized around self-protection to be done with it. He was complicated. She was damaged. They were both in the process of becoming something they couldn't name yet. That was the most accurate description she had, and she'd stopped trying to improve on it. On a Saturday in late October, almost a year to the week from the night she'd shattered the crystal glass, she was in his kitchen making coffee, which was something she'd started doing on weekends because she liked the kitchen and she liked the particular quality of morning light through the east windows, and she liked knowing where everything was in a space without having to check. She reached into the cabinet for a mug and knocked it with her elbow. A small brown mug, ceramic, nothing valuable. And it went off the edge of the counter and hit the tile and broke into 3 clean pieces. She stood there, looked at it. Her body did not go to its knees. Her hands did not move toward the pieces before she'd registered the decision to move them. Her breath did not stop. She just stood there and looked at the broken mug on the tile floor. And after a moment, she bent down and picked up the 3 pieces and set them on the counter and opened the cabinet under the sink and found the dustpan and swept up the smaller fragments and threw them away. She was at the counter pouring the coffee when Damien came into the kitchen. He looked at the broken pieces on the counter and then at her. "I broke a mug," she said. "I can see that. You had 8, now you have 7. He looked at her face. His face did the thing it did sometimes, something quiet and watchful that wasn't pity and wasn't satisfaction, and was somewhere in the complex territory between recognition and care. "You okay?" he said. "Yes." She handed him the coffee she'd poured. I'm actually okay. He took it, stood beside her at the counter for a moment, looking out the window at the coast, at the October water going gray and cold under the low sky. A familiar silence, not the silence of two people who have nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have said enough of the necessary things that silence no longer requires filling. The woman who called last week, he said, the one from the Portland shelter. Reyes. Her name is Reyes. She's going to take the case coordinator position? She said yes yesterday. Elena wrapped her hands around her own mug. The crooked fingers, the old scars, the skin that was what it was. She's good. She's been doing this informally for 3 years out of a church basement in Lewiston, and she's better at it than most people who get paid for it. What does that bring you to? Staff. 4 full-time, 2 part-time, 6 active cases. She paused. 14 on the waiting list. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need? More money, more time, an additional attorney on retainer. She looked out the window. The same things everyone needs. The money I can help with. The time. He stopped. I can't give you more time. Nobody can. They stood there with the October light coming through the window and the coffee going warm in their hands and the coast doing what it always did. Indifferent, continuous, the water moving because that was what water did. She thought about the storage unit in Providence, about Teller's face when she'd walked up the stairs, about the feel of Stern's phone in her hand after she'd picked it up from the table, the plastic warm from his grip. She thought about Patricia Mercer's white knuckles in the courtroom, and Gerald Mercer's empty face, and the 22 pages of the suppression motion that had called her unstable, and the judge's 2 paragraphs that had called her credible. She thought about Judith, who was consulting for a federal task force now, who had sent Elena a text last week that said simply, "Use the expertise." Turns out it was good for something after all. She thought about the 14 people on the waiting list, each one with a specific problem and a specific need and the intelligence and the agency that no one had bothered to account for before. She thought about walking into that federal records annex with her heart in her throat and her hands shaking inside the bandages, and nothing in her hands but the conviction that stopping was not an option. She thought about being 12 years old in a house that used the word family as a threat. She thought about the crooked fingers on her left hand, healed wrong because no one had set them, and how they ached in cold weather, which in Maine was most weather, and how she'd stopped registering the ache as a reminder of where it came from and had started registering it as simply cold today. That was the change. Not dramatic, not a moment you could point to and say there, that's when it happened. Just the accumulation of days in which the same thing meant something different than it had the day before. She became aware that Damien was watching her. "What?" she said. "You went somewhere." "I was thinking." "You think differently than you used to?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "When you first came here," he said, "you thought the way someone thinks who's managing a threat. Quick, small, close to the surface. Everything processed for danger." He looked out the window for a moment. "You still do that, but now there's something underneath it, something slower." She considered this. It was accurate. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. "I'm making plans," she said. "Long-term plans. Things I haven't let myself think about in 4 years because long-term thinking requires a version of the future, and I didn't have one." She paused. "Reyes wants to eventually expand to New Hampshire. Judith thinks there might be federal funding available for the documentation work specifically. Chen mentioned connecting me with 2 other organizations doing similar work in other regions." She looked at Damien. "I've been thinking about what a national network looks like. Not now. 2, 3 years out. Whether it's possible." He held her gaze. Something in his face settled. Not surprise, but the expression of someone watching a thing become more itself, more fully what it always was trying to be. "It's possible," he said. "I know." She turned back to the window. "I'm still figuring out how." Outside, the October coast went about its indifferent business. The water moved, the light shifted, the bare trees along the property line held their position against a sky that was deciding whether to rain. Inside, in the kitchen that had been the most honest room in this house, Since the night she'd knelt on the marble floor and let a man she didn't know look at her hands, Elena Ashford drank her coffee and felt the ache in her crooked fingers and made plans. She was 27 years old. She had a nonprofit with 4 full-time staff and an office with decent light and a waiting list that was proof of both what was broken and what was possible. She had a name on court documents. She had a testimony that existed now in the permanent record. She had a key to this house on her keychain next to the key to her office in Portland. 2 keys that together represented the whole of what she owned and that felt, against her palm, like enough. She was not healed. She had come to understand that healed was a story people told about a destination that didn't exist. That what actually existed was forward, just forward, one day following the next, each one slightly less governed by what had happened before it. That was the work. Not arriving somewhere clean and resolved, but doing the next day in a way that was marginally less shaped by damage than the day before. She was good at it. She was getting better. The mug was broken on the counter in 3 clean pieces, and she hadn't gone to her knees and the coffee was warm in her hands, and outside the coast went on being what it always was. Old, patient, entirely unconcerned with the specific gravity of what happened in the rooms of the houses that sat above it. Damien reached past her and picked up the 3 pieces of the mug from the counter. He looked at them for a moment. Then he set them in the trash can under the sink, gently, with the particular care of someone who has learned to do small things carefully. He came back and stood beside her at the counter. He didn't say anything, neither did she. The light came through the east window and the water moved against the rocks, and forward document had 14 people on a waiting list, and the testimony was in the permanent record, and there was enough coffee for another cup each, which was what the morning required. And it was enough, and the day went on. The scars on her hands had faded by winter. Not gone. They were never going to be gone, and she'd stopped wanting them to be. Somewhere around the time she'd started understanding that wanting them gone was a way of wanting the history erased, and the history was also the testimony, and the testimony was the thing that had made the difference. So she kept the history. She just stopped letting it be the loudest thing in the room. By December, Forward Document had moved its waiting list from 14 to 9. 5 cases resolved. Not perfectly, because nothing resolved perfectly, but forward. A 19-year-old in Bangor with a corrupted identity got new documentation and a housing referral. A 22-year-old in Augusta got the legal assistance she needed to push back on a fraudulent debt that had been attached to her name by people who'd had access to her file. A young man in Concord got connected to an attorney who found that his original placement had been coordinated through a foundation subsidiary. One of the organization's Crane's cooperation agreement had exposed in the secondary investigations, and that finding had consequences for people still operating in that network. Each case was a small machine. Elena had come to think of them that way. Not as stories, not as narratives she was part of, but as machines with specific components that needed specific attention in a specific order. The sentiment was for later, for after the machine was running. During, you focused on the parts. Reyes was good at the parts. Better than Elena, in some ways. She had a warmth that Elena had to work at, a natural ease in the first meeting with a new client that put people at rest in the first 5 minutes instead of the first 5 sessions. Elena watched her work sometimes and thought about what it must be like to carry that ease, to not have to build it deliberately from the ground up every time. She asked Reyes about it once, in the office in Portland, after a client meeting that Reyes had run while Elena observed. "How do you do that?" Elena said. "The first 10 minutes. Reyes looked at her. "Do what?" "Make them feel safe that fast." Reyes considered it genuinely, the way she considered most things. "I tell them I'm not going to fix them," she said. "First thing, right at the start. I say, I'm not here to fix you. I'm here to fix the specific problem you walked in with." And they relax because they've spent their whole lives being treated like something that needs fixing, and the moment you take that off the table, she shrugged, they breathe. Elena sat with that. "I should be doing that." "You do it differently," Reyes said. "You do it by being what you are. They look at you and they know you know what they know." A pause. "That's its own kind of first 10 minutes. Elena thought about that on the drive back to the estate that Friday. The coast road going dark and cold around her, headlights on the bare trees, the water somewhere beyond the tree line doing what it always did. She thought about what it meant to be useful for what you actually were, rather than for a version of yourself with the difficult parts edited out. She had spent years trying to be smaller than her history. Now the history was the credential. There was a freedom in that, and it was not clean or simple, but it was real. Yitung. In January, Chen called. The Mercer sentencing was complete. The Foundation's assets, after forfeiture proceedings and the months of forensic accounting that preceded them, had been partially liquidated and placed into a victim compensation fund administered by the federal court. The fund was substantial. The number Chen gave her was large enough that Elena had to ask her to repeat it. That money, Elena said, where is it going? Distributed to verified victims through the court's process. There's also a portion designated for organizations providing direct services to the affected population. Chen paused. I submitted forward documents named to the designating committee. You should expect a letter. Elena was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell me you were going to do that. I didn't want you to talk me out of it. I wouldn't have. She stopped. Chen had known her for long enough to be accurate about this. Thank you, she said instead. The work you're doing is the right use of that money, Chen said. That's not a courtesy. That's just true. After she hung up, Elena sat in the office in Portland for a long time without moving. The letter would come. The money would come. The waiting list of 9 would become a waiting list of 6, and then 3, and eventually, maybe, with enough time and enough staff and enough of the specific work that had no shortcut, eventually it would be a waiting list that moved fast enough that people didn't wait long. She pulled up the organizational charter on her screen, read the one page she'd written and not changed. Then she opened a new document and started writing the expansion plan for the New Hampshire operation, which she'd been holding in her head for 2 months, and which now, with what Chen had just told her, had become something real enough to put on paper. She wrote for 2 hours. When she stopped, it was dark outside, and the office was cold because she'd forgotten to adjust the heat, and her hands ached the way they always ached in winter, and she flexed the crooked fingers of her left hand against her palm and held them there a moment, feeling the resistance of the old damage, and then released them. She saved the document, put her coat on, locked the office. Outside, the Portland street was quiet in the January dark. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed in the cold air, which was sharp enough to feel like something definite, and looked up at the sky, which was clear enough to show stars over the city's ambient light. She thought about a 12-year-old girl in a basement room in winter. She thought about that girl the way she thought about someone she used to know, with the particular grief of clear memory and the particular steadiness of someone who has survived to be something the younger version couldn't have imagined. Not better, exactly. Not healed. Just further along the same road, carrying the same things differently. She got in her car and drove north toward the coast. The estate was lit when she arrived, the front windows warm against the dark, which was something she'd started to count on without having decided to, the way you count on things that have simply been true enough times to register as reliable. She pulled in and cut the engine and sat for a moment in the driveway, looking at the lit windows, letting the drive settle out of her body. Then she went inside, and the house was warm, and Damien was in the study with work spread across the desk the way it always was, and he looked up when she came in and said nothing, which was the thing she'd come to understand was its own language, a language of people who had said the necessary things and now operated in the space that the necessary things had made. She set her bag down, unwound her scarf, stood in the doorway of the study. Chen called, she said. Good call or complicated call? Good. She leaned against the doorframe. Forward document is going to be funded by the Mercer Foundation's seized assets. He looked at her. Something moved through his face, that old and specific and quiet. That's right, he said. That's exactly right. She nodded, looked at the window, at the dark coast beyond it, at the water that was there even when you couldn't see it. 14 people on a waiting list had become 9, and 9 would become less, and the money from the thing that had built her damage was going to fund the work of addressing it in other people. And the math of that was not clean or satisfying in any simple way, but it was true. And truth was the thing she'd decided to operate on when she ran out of other options. She pushed off the doorframe and went to make tea because it was late and cold, and that was what the moment needed. And outside the coast went on in the dark, patient and permanent, and forward document had 9 people on a waiting list, and the expansion plan was saved on her hard drive, and the morning would come the way mornings came, steady and indifferent, and full of the specific work that had no shortcut, no end, and was, in the end, the whole point.